Hello everyone, today we talk about early Christian monasticism and the figure of Pachomius. So really the very beginning of the monastic expressions. I made two videos recently that might be of interest to frame more or less the period and what we're talking about. The first one is the elaboration of Christian monasticism between the 3rd and the 6th century that basically takes into consideration broadly this setting of especially the Egypt, and that we will focus to today, but more broadly also the expansion on that point of monasticism through the Near East and eventually into Europe up to essentially the Benedictine order was founded. And the other one is a bit more rhetorological, let's say, and it's called instead The Roots of Christian Monasticism, in which I discuss instead essentially how Christian monasticism was born on the influence of other monastic experiences in other religions. Think about Buddhism, but not only, in more general from let's say similar experiences that at a certain point had characterized certain communities, certain thoughts, certain philosophies, certain religions, and from which Christianity drew in its first days in models. Also in here, before I start, it should be reminded that naturally we're not excessively documented about early monasticism. There is naturally a lot of posterior geographical sources that discuss about this, but what is interesting in my opinion, and we'll try to say today, is how really progressive and spontaneous and coming from other experiences, similar or shared experiences would be better, the early Christian monasticism really was. So, talking about Christians specifically, the very first manifestations or expression of the monastic secession from the world in Christianity were in Hermetic form. So you know that what monk and hence monasticism basically means. Monk derives from ancient Greek, means from the term monad that we also use in other contexts, also in philosophy and so on, to define essentially a being that is kind of isolated in itself. It works as one. It's a sort of a in this specific context, as in monastic terms, an isolated, a secluded person, but at the same time that is self-sufficient, that is kind of complete in itself. Naturally, in the Christian message, this has to do with the human nature as such, that has to tend naturally towards God, that also has in the person of the Son had a human nature, and that therefore can in this isolation basically experience in this case the passion, actually the suffering, the deprivations that Jesus had during his passion practice, and not only, because naturally also in the New Testament Jesus does at a certain point he goes out into the desert. He starts living this model of contemplation, of reflection, that was in this sense imitated among other things, among the other teachings by his disciples, by his followers, by the Christians at this point. And if you want, it's a very romantic way of conceiving the world. It's also kind of interesting I believe in perspective, historically speaking, on how, first of all, these experiences have been shared, as we've seen, by several cultures, but also how there is always a kind of need sometimes for human beings, especially when they're so, can say, disappointed or stressed, or let's say have a moment of general distress, and they want really to find themselves once again. This is something that happens very often. Just today I was trying to sleep. There were noisy neighbors. I couldn't, so I said, oh my god, I wish I could go there in the peaceful of the wilderness, not to be bothered by by such things. And it is obviously this is a very trivial parallelism, but there is at a deeper level, I believe, in the human spiritual experience such a desire deep inside to live not necessarily completely isolated. This is also very important, and it's a characteristic of early monasticism that, stemming from Hermetism, however, aims to build substantially another society, because there are other people who aggregate, who basically come together, but that they share, in this sense, a common spiritual life that goes beyond the simple, simple, but just belonging to the church and living your whatever you like. It's really sort of an alienation and detachment from the temptations, because this was also geographically really the point, resisting the devil just like Jesus had done, and finding, in a way, your true self, that in this perspective was the Christian self, and getting closer to that Jesuit teaching that the Christians follow. So this first experience was born for the Christians in the deserts of Egypt, roughly between the 3rd and the 4th century. So as far as we can see, it was a relatively late event. I mean, Judaism, in origin actually had some forms of monasticism in the etymological sense we've just explained, so not the full structured monastic rule, but this kind of experiences in the wilderness, especially among those Judaic tribes that lived more isolated, in fact, from the greater centers, like Jerusalem, for instance, that had been, in this sense, the harbor of also a great, there were big urban centers, so they were quite animated, multi-ethnical, multicultural centers where new ideas, different influences, and different culture at this point existed in there. Palestine at this point was, and Egypt were specifically now under the Roman Empire, of course, and therefore it might be, I'm not a great expert, but I think it's quite evident that certain monastic practices probably existed in early Christianity. I can say since the very beginning in itself, because it's not that we have a historical proof of this, but at the same time it's pretty much obvious that this research wasn't completely invented and didn't come out of the blue 200, 300 years after Christ, which is a freaking long time, but they were probably already shared before. Now, what happened now is that these forms began to be more organized. This is also the moment of transition between the pagan Roman Empire and the Christian Roman Empire. So I suspect that, this is just a speculation, but I think it's pretty obvious that certain monastic experiences, now Christianity was quite developed and very diverse already at this time, so probably these first monastic experiences of Pachomius, St. Basil, etc. were something that probably was emphasized, especially in this moment of passage through the Roman tolerance towards Christianity, and that's essentially the 4th century, the crucial moment into which Christians start to come out in the open, because before they were persecuted, or when they weren't, they were usually marginalized, and especially in the statal offices and so on. From the 4th century, you start having Christian scholars, Christians in the administration, and so on. So at this point, also the interest and possibility of writing down about certain masters that had carried out this life of sacrifice, of deprivement, etc., was say easier. And I would be interested to deepen actually the very origins, the roots proper of Christian monasticism, that probably are evidently kind of more complex than just this initial forms of living that were now, as we will see, characterized, as far as we know, historically for the first time by a rule. So they weren't just spontaneous individual experiences, not even spontaneous communitarian experiences. They were now essentially structuring themselves as a sort of model also for others that could be replicated and exported elsewhere. And so these first hermits were essentially solitary people, loners, that actually came from very different social backgrounds. I mean, what is interesting about Christianity at this point, especially in the East, is that this religion was spreading essentially among a consistent part of the population in the social spectrum, let's say. So it's and also in this Near East was, as we've seen, quite multicultural in many ways. So there were several people that were coming a bit from different backgrounds, from different ideas, etc., that were trying to experiment such new forms of living, and that probably also were converting in this very moment, or maybe were eventually patronized by the same Christians, because maybe they were doing them on their own and weren't even fully sure what, thinking that just that heresies at these times were out there in Christianity quite prominently. It's in fact with Nicaea in 325 that in that case the major Arian heresy was the Nicene Creed was defined, and also Arianism condemned. But the point is that there were so many different. I mean, the doctrine at this point was still pretty fluid. The interpretation of the scriptures was still largely interpretable in some different ways, and it's difficult in such a syncretic environment from a religious and cultural point of view to even isolate the very first monastic experiences in this sense. And even the first Christians were coming from very different cultural background. This is what I'm trying to say. These hermits usually chose as basically for a stay in the wilderness certain environments that could be also here relatively different. I mean, there were naturally depopulated places. There were certain sepulchral environments. That means cemeteries and holy places of sort where this idea of spirituality even evidently existed also before Christianity. So the Christians were also, this would be very interesting to analyze. I mean, how there is this general idea the Christians basically arrived and started crashing everything that existed before, but at the same time there was also a genuine transformation of certain holy places, places of cult, of sepulchral areas, and that were sometimes all like one. And this were to transform into Christian centers proper, not to be properly destroyed. Also because in the ancient world, this idea of this monastic ideal in a sort of monad sense of the word was present at many levels. I mean, even if you think about the cities, sometimes there were, especially in these great Hellenistic capitals, there were certain sanctuaries, for instance, dedicated to the various pagan deities that were sort of a city within the city. I mean, the same sanctuary could be something, infrastructurally very big, could work as a fortress in practice, and there were lots of people who were working for that sanctuary that had clientele. So it was tied to the rich aristocrats that patronized such communities, and so on. So the idea of belonging to that specific, it's almost a corporative idea in some way. So in part, such idea of community, especially from a religious point of view, was very deeply felt. That's also probably where the Christians drew in part from their ideals. Other times, the areas where these hermits went were even things like grottos, caverns, caves, places that could offer them a shelter just as in this natural environment. But consider also what the mentality of the time could really be towards these physical places. I mean, the ancient world, in many cases, especially in these, was conceived in its most, especially in the rural areas, etc., still as a largely truly polytheistic world. I mean, the idea, or even animistic in some ways, where I don't know, a certain cave, a certain tree, a certain mountain, or whatever, was thought to be sacred objectively, that it had inherent powers on its own as a sort of entity that dominated those places. It was kind of unique in its kind. So even, you know, from a psychological point of view, the idea of finding a new place to stay that somehow characterizes and defines your spiritual experience was very much incentivized by such vision of the world that at the time, especially in polytheism, and was kind of the norm. You know, that at this point, really, I'm making this distinction because, especially with the cities, because at this time the Hellenistic world had seen the rise of some kind of henotheism, certain kind of not really of monotheism proper, but, you know, an increasing hierarchization of the deities that at that point reflected the transformation of society, also here in something more verticized politically. This was typical, by the way, of regions like, in fact, Egypt or Persia, etc., because that albeit pagan had always kind of seen the preeminence of a certain deity that corresponded, in fact, in a social spectrum to the hierarchical order of the great empires, you know, dominated by shahs, by pharaohs, by Roman emperors. Then in part were, you know, now also absorbing, of course, had absorbed the heavily Hellenistic culture, but were also, you know, coming from, you know, like Latin culture coming from Western Europe was a bit different, and that's also why probably Eastern monasticism was eventually developing a bit on its own in many ways. I mean, in the West, and this is what I was arguing in that video about the elaboration of Christian monasticism, is that you see that there is an objective difference also between Eastern and Western monasticism in Christianity. Not meaning, you know, of course this was inherited by the Eastern monasticism, meaning the Byzantine monasticism, that was different definitely from a Benedictine one, for instance, even obviously sharing certain essentials. But also the idea is that a vision of, you know, there were different visions of the world between the two halves of the Mediterranean, and in part the same Hellenistic world was kind of transforming towards a sort of monotheism, some sort of, or I mean, it was heading towards that direction at least. In earlier times, especially also in Europe, the various deities and figures were kind of more scattered. They weren't really framed into a hierarchical order and so on. This was more present in Asia, definitely, in Egypt, where societies had been stratified since millennia, with the idea of the ruler was a kind of a divine entity and so on. In the Roman Empire, you never quite had this. I mean, you had the deification of emperors post-mortem, etc., and you had naturally, especially with the Christian Roman Empire, a very, you know, special role of the emperor, also as, you know, essentially as a divine appointee that also is presiding the church, especially in the East, because this is what remained like in the Byzantine Empire. So also in here, it's interesting to see that the very early monastic experiences were also dictated probably by experiences that went that came also in here from kind of different backgrounds, that probably were also influenced by the more, say, we can say, traditional paganism than maybe strict monotheism or henotheism. But this is just an impression. The idea is, however, that processes like catharsis and so on are usually come when there is a kind of an absolutization of the religious mindset. I mean, either with something so radical, if you want, like Buddhism, that is basically in part of a denial of the same human materiality. I don't know how to say that, so for which you have to really even abandon this world in many ways. And even in monotheism, when basically you absolutize a God that is transcendental, that is not visible, it's not really, of course in Christianity God is also visible, but at least it takes a kind of an extra sensorial and essentially spiritual experience to access to. Just like, I don't know, the torture for the martyrs, for instance, and martyr essentially means witness of Christ, because at that point you had the vision of Christ before your death, and that's what made you participating into his, basically being graced, being blessed, and that way they were eventually sanctified most. And this was thought naturally in Christianity to be achieved through this life of deprivement, essentially. So to suffer so much, to basically re-experience Christ's passion and to arrive there. But probably, and this is what I'm just speculating about now, that probably these monastic experiences were originally much more varied and influenced by several inputs at this point, not just this real absolutization. And really, since even at the times of Jesus, you find, as we've said before, for Judaic monotheism, etc., these communities that lived essentially in the wilderness, in part, they were out there. So this was kind of typical of that world in many ways, and it's something that I'm not really aware from literature, for instance, but it's pretty evident. It was normal for this time, for those even for those societies and those economies, to have a part of the people who could live out there in the wild, really trying to maintain a relation with the divine in many ways. This is something that existed, by the way, also in the Germanic world. We've seen it many times. When you think about this kind of outcasts that went out from communities, and basically they were possessed by the deities, and they were living in the wilderness as kind of crazed and possessed individuals whose life kind of didn't belong to them anymore. Well, that's obviously a bit different, because it entails a completely different ethics and morality from the Christian one. It is also very civil in many ways. It's not Christian experience is not specifically designed for this, but it's still kind of similar. And this is also in part the duality of Christianism, in many ways, because from one side you have from the same Gospels, let's still aside the Old Testament, that also is pretty eloquent and kind of supportive of civilization as such, but in Christianity you have these different tensions that are from one side civil, because there is a consistent part of the Christian message that is basically oriented towards the spread of Christ's word into civilization proper. Think about St. Paul's letters, or this idea that even of the respect, intrinsic respect for authority as well. It is something that makes differing substantially. Respect towards secular authority. It is something that substantially, for instance, divides Christianity from Islam in many ways. So that also politically and socially, these produce very different results. But from the other side, you have this kind of extremization of the let's say, also the popularistic message of the gospel, for which at a certain point even a Christian has to go out there, living far from other people. And this is typical of many societies. As we have said, in tribalism, many rites of passage have to do with this physical isolation from the rest of the group, this experiencing the terrible nature that is bringing you, to such deprivations. It's so difficult to survive in there, but it's a kind of a proof of toughening up. And this is also what basically Christianity has in Nietzsche in itself. And interestingly enough, these two different tensions were sometimes conflictual toward one another. Let's leave aside that certain hermetic experiences could be extremely radical. They could really bring to a mortification of the body of certain behaviors that are also kind of difficult to understand, and were difficult to understand at the time for the same Christians, because not everybody kind of feels that that should be a model. But in part, that's the point. I mean, Christianity offers you this wide range of aspects of life you can basically, that Jesus offered kind of a model to live in. And there is obviously a connective tissue of all this. There is a general common perspective, but in the actual church, there was an increasing suspicion also toward, especially and mutual disliking sometimes between the secular clergy, that is the one that lived essentially in the cities as bishops and priests and so on, and the monks. And this is something that will remain, historically speaking, also because now evidently such Christian societies kind of that they live in different environments with different lifestyles and so on. But the interesting fact is also there was a point of contact. I mean, the Hermetic experience it never excludes actually the possible reintegration into society. That was not really the point. It was a sort of meditation, of spiritual training, if you want, that at one point could even put at the service of the community. In fact, in the very first centuries of Christianity, also in Western Europe, especially in Gaul and some, especially in Provence, in those areas, it was normal to make a sort of apprenticeship as a monk, then eventually becoming a bishop, because that was a qualifying experience. Like saying, you have been a monk, that has been very useful for you. You have reached a certain level of spiritual perfection that others don't have. So it was kind of even required. And also the same Hermetic models entailed that they had to serve as an example for the rest of the Christian community. Other people had to watch hermits. Think about the Stylites that lived at the top of columns, remaining there all their lives. How we don't really know. Probably they were brought food, because that's not another way you can survive in those conditions. But I mean, exposed to the weather, to all the worst kind of privations. And but we're full of those examples in Christian geography. And this was done also in places where there were people who were passing there, I don't know, at crossroads, or even close to the settlements, probably, so that those people could show, those hermits could show the rest of the world what their choice was, and how radical it was, and how seriously the Christian message has to be taken into consideration. But as we were saying before, also here nothing completely new from other experiences that had existed at that point for millennia, I guess, all over Eurasia and beyond. Sometimes the retirement places of the hermits could be really different, like rocky plants or elevated wilderness. Also, certain mountains, top of mountains, very luminous places, or and naturally, in more realistical terms, like also for the obvious need of survival of these people, they were preferably chosen, places chosen into close to certain little streams of water and or trees or grasses that could feed, essentially sustain physically the hermit, and could even go give, let's say, something more in terms of material to build, for instance, huts, and this progressively evolved, in fact, into even hermits who were working, plowing, cultivating the land, and storing this supplies and so on. And this is probably the most important part, and this is where monasticism, even in the organized social form of cenobitism, came into play, because evidently, certain extreme experiences of excuse me, 1 second, of deprivation, of sacrifice, were are unsustainable up to a certain point. I mean, obviously, there are many people who are capable of doing certain things, but objectively, you're gonna kill yourself practically if you keep doing that. And there is much evidence throughout all Christian history of certain people who were evidently oriented. At this point, they would probably be classified with some kind of mental disturb in some way that brought themselves to kill themselves. And naturally, I'm not trying to kind of diminish that, because naturally these people did it evidently for a spiritual tension that was very, very evident and very evidently driven by a true Christian faith in many ways. But at the same time, it's kind of debatable. We have so many even consolations of parents that had lost their young their sons and daughters because they had brought themselves basically to die of deprivation, and without eating, and just praying and humiliating their bodies in the emulation of Christ. This happened all of Christian history, and I would say it's normal in part that in a society there are people with such psychological, with such a mindset that can bring them to behave like that. So it's this was interpreted naturally at a point in what was a wholly Christian society as in that specific function, but it might have also concealed other forms of. But nevertheless, also, these are naturally the most extreme things. And what I was saying is that objectively this was rare, and that these hermits were social beings that were also needing to survive and to have a purpose, to build something out of this experience, to get the essentially essentials for living. Because the idea of monasticism is really not and this is where it kind of grew to be something also productive in terms of civilization. Thinking about the great medieval monasticism and what it brought in terms also of learning, of working, and so on, is that there was a need to the monasticism is essentially wants to create a society out of scratch, without necessarily destroying the other one, but hoping. Because that was not the point. Of course, the Bible, especially in the Old Testament, presents the eventuality also of a vengeful God that basically decides to destroy not just certain communities, but at a certain point when humanity became evil, to basically flood the whole world and saving just the real pure. So there was this time also in Christianity a particular tension for which. Also the interpretation of the scriptures, as we've seen, was pretty fluid. There were many influences. There was the veterotestamentary model that was consistently differing in part to the Christian one. So the real problem, the real point here is the monks wanted to create essentially a new society. A society that was based on Christ's teaching and that had partially nothing to do with the secular one. This is very important because even when monasticism flourished to late Roman, medieval times especially, at the base of monasteries became quite they became even seigneurial powers. Certain monasteries had even armies on their own. They were heavily involved in politics. They owned a huge amounts of lands. They were extremely powerful entities that, in this sense, were not just looking at the spiritual side of the story, but at the base of Christian monasticism never really came, really never vanished the idea that the monastery had to be essentially a copy of the heavenly Jerusalem, and that in this sense the secular world was kind of irreconcilable with this. I mean, of course, monasticism in itself, even with the same rules, was obviously acknowledging the limits of the human being. Of course, heavenly Jerusalem is something that only Christ will come to bring back basically on Earth. Humans are not capable of it, but there is always that tension, and at least the model was in this sense completely detached from secular society. And also in here the need to even have a physical space you want to experience this lifestyle. Because even the monastery, the concept of the wall of the inner side is naturally metaphorical, but it's also physical in many ways. It is very important because, historically speaking, this has been interpreted in this moment of the late Roman Empire, in the early Middle Ages and so on, as a moment as a result of the despair that had grown, the disaffection, the fear, the tension, the insecurity that existed in that world because of the invasions, because of the economical crisis, and because of the general decay of its civilization that was now contracting, practically resizing or shrinking, how you want to say it, and where such world was sometimes even a better choice than the secular one. In fact, also from a strictly economical point of view, just think how many people practically lived in their conditions, even into cities or somewhere. So really going out there in the wild and start, living of gathering and picking up, and starting plowing land and living. It was sometimes even an economical option. We don't want to have anything to do with society. We want to stay out of it. We don't like it. We don't like violence. We don't like what was going on. Naturally, also in here, the situation was very diverse. Just think about what happened in Roman Africa with Donatism, the bands of brigands that existed into the countryside. So, also, monastic communities. I'm not aware of extreme violence that took place on there, but sometimes these organizations were also involved in actively in certain, especially certain heresies. Like in the case of Donatism, is brilliant. In there, you have so many communities that lived isolated from the cities, but they pillaged constantly the properties, the latifundia, and so on. So also in here, it's also the shifting of the world towards the city to the countryside once again. At least with the decline of the Roman urban infrastructural system, you have also this need of coming back to the land. And this happened at all levels of society. I mean, the Roman villa at this point was reflourishing. It was transforming as a sort of, it was at the base of encapsulation in many ways. I discussed this several times. There is a video, I think it's called From the Late Roman Villa to the from late antique villa to the early medieval cortes, that essentially explains this. But there is also another video, The Transformation of the West from the 3rd to the 6th century, that actually show you how it was a bit the world society that was coming back. And this Hermetism, in part, was also stemming from a certain positive taste also for tranquility, for peacefulness. The Roman otium or otium, as you want to say, was a model that had existed since the origins of Roman society, in the idea of abandoning the city for a while, going to the villa, and obviously this was mostly an elite thing. It wasn't really for poor people, because the otium was for the aristocracy. And now was still basically about that, but the idea was that there was a sort of moral of harmony, basically, at the base of such experiences, of essentially building a world from there. So managing your estate, getting acquainted with your roots, basically, and creating something productive, not just from a material point of view, but also especially from a spiritual point of view. Well, this already existed into Latin culture, let's say. Also, in the same part here, monasticism is doing in reverse the same thing, because there is an even spiritual direction, but there is also a material dimension of this that is very clear from hagiography. if you study the earlier geography, especially in early medieval Europe, you realize that there is always in these geographies a reference to food, to animals, to fresh waters. I mean, all these elements of nature that were essentially coexisting with the monk, with the hermit, that God basically was showing, benevolence by making the monk finding fruits and so on, or drinking the milk of some animal, or and therefore all this blessing that derived as naturally as a reward for having lived having made this leap of faith, also of abandoning the world and going to live into the wilderness. It was definitely a tough experience, and behind the rhetorics, let's say, the more prosaic elements of this, there is also the strictly physical dimension of the miracle. For instance, a lot of miracles in early medieval monasticism geography had to do with certain food appearing by miracle. While maybe there was a famine or the harvest had gone destroyed for some reason, or the communities were desperate, and the monks were helping them. Even the secular communities in the forests and the wood that lived in there as peasants, as woodmen, etc., that were benefiting from the divine miracle of making certain plants grow, certain products magically appear, and that was the concept that shows you the poverty of that world, and that how important it was to live, to have even a small resource to survive basically in that time. And that wasn't at that point so different from the secular world, because most of the people out there lived, in fact, into the countryside, into rural areas, with the same problems, with this attention towards, essentially was a survival economy. And also in here, the monastic lifestyle was objectively not that different from the average secular one at that point. Excuse me, I drink a little. So the need for essentially for creating something, even as a community, was spreading at this point in these monastic experiences, because in certain desertic areas, where here we've seen we're talking about Egypt in the 3rd, 4th century. There were several people now that had maybe shared initially these individual experiences, and now were essentially gathering into a group, and were now living a sort of colony of anachorites, of recluses, let's say. So people who literally lived detached, away from reality. They were praying and working for most of the time, were kind of essentially isolated from the rest of the world. But they were, however, creating their own world. They were helping each other materially, and they were also meeting naturally as Christians to practice the periodically liturgical acts, and also to receive advice from the elderly and the most experienced, that in this sense were also presenting a model. The same Bible offers this. I mean, there is always a wiser figure that is showing you the way, that had gone through. There is a respect towards. There was a respect towards those who had already been living like that, and naturally, the idea of the master with his disciples and so on was reflected also in a Christ-like fashion in these communities, and it's from this say different authoritative level that also the same monastic or hierarchy and organization were to stem. And very interestingly, most of even of this elderly and more authoritative um, hermits were not just, we've seen that the background of these people could be quite varied, but most of them were actually, at least a consistent part of them, were actually very cultured people. And some of them came from sometimes even eminent families. This is very important because it shows that since the very beginning there was a very strong bond between monasticism and aristocracy in some way. Also in here there is a sort of conflict of breaking with reality, because the aristocracies of the time weren't so open to the idea of of converting to those lifestyles, because pagan aristocracies at this time, but every kind of aristocracies, even the Christian one, was substantially very worldly, and didn't conceive the idea that, I don't know, a very young, promising person would basically abandon all of his goods and go away living in the desert. But this had been objectively the fate of many of these individuals that had been living in the world, in the seculum, and had even people of world, they were worldly people. They knew what the world was about, and that in this sense had made an active choice, also on the base of their intellectual education, to basically go out there and make this experience. It's something you find today as well. It's not so rare objectively. There are these kind of life-changing experiences that come from, I don't know, a trip or a particular... there are many people who like to go there in the wilderness to live like that. The world has not really changed that much. The forms might be different, but the contents in part are substantially the same. So in 4th century Egypt, there was also the final different solution of this monastic tension that came out chiefly, at least from what we know, from the life of Pachomius, who, starting perhaps from the 20s of the 4th century, started to organize this very thick groups of penitents slash ascetics in a rigorously collective form. So the so-called cenobites. So they were essentially cohabiting in certain buildings. They were rigidly obedient to a naboth, so a father essentially. That this same name was used for the most distinguished and illustrious anachorets, and also the most authoritative ones, as we've seen it. So these were conceived as fathers, as models to be revered in many ways, and the organization could be very, as we've seen, very strict. I mean, since the early monasticism, we see that cenobitic life was very, very harsh. I mean, the idea is, obviously, it was not excessively harsh. It wasn't like starving to death, like we have seen before, in this fashion that can also make us rather perplexed overall. But let's say what these communities wanted to achieve was a sort of uniformation in lifestyle, in the codes of living. I mean, initially this had to come theoretically from the inner push, the inner tension, the spirituality. That in Christianity, the spiritual experience is very individual, it's very private, etc. But it's pretty obvious that when you start living in these communities, problems always start. So the for some reason. There is an inherent attrition factors in human societies that has to bring to an order through an authority in some ways. So the rules were quite rigid because they were thought to be effective. I mean, they had a deterrence, and they had essentially the purpose of preventing any fault, every kind of lack of dedication, of commitment to this experience that evidently was sacred in the essentials, and it was meant to be a sort of divine, growing closer to the divine. So even living into the inherent problem of the community is that it was a community. So it wasn't just about the individual that definitely had his or her own conscience, because we'll see it was full of also of women in this experience, and the early Cenobitic experiences had actually a strong female presence as well. But that was the point. You could be individually oriented towards this inner tension, without which in Christianity you can't do anything. But at the same time, there could be an influence that the lack of faith or any kind of mistake could influence the whole community, so making it less pure as a whole. The monastic experience is the idea that at this point not just of the hermit, but of the whole community. So the community doesn't have to be seen as a whole. And this is something that actually existed also in paganism. That was the idea, and that's the inherent reason for which Christians had been persecuted. I mean, the idea that if the whole community doesn't sacrifice to the gods, even if there is a single person that has done something wrong, God will punish the whole community. And since the Christians didn't practice the sacrifice to the essentially burning 2 grains of frankincense to the altar for the imperial deity, well, this was enough basically to basically anger the gods and make bad things happen. So consider, sometimes we treat Christianity as if it was born out of the blue, or that it was born already as a strictly defined experience. But this was a world that was coming straight from polytheism. So even certain practices and certain ideas, certain mindsets definitely remained into the Christian experience, the Christian view of the world, that was still pretty much tied to this, because the concept of sacrum, or what is holy, is also here. It was very much, there is so much in common that Christianity and paganism had in practice. And the same monastic experience, as we've seen before, was essentially stemming from people who might have even not been of strictly Christian background. And on the contrary, you have to think that many Christians at this point, now we conceive Christians as exclusively Christian, as monotheists, so people who had embraced fully, just Christ as their Lord and Savior, and that's it. But at the beginning it wasn't like that. I mean, most of the Christians that existed at that point were Christians, and actually also still venerating other and worshipping other deities. I've made a video just recently that has not to do specifically with the ancient world, but it concerns the Germanic, this would be the Viking era religion of the North, which is entitled Christian Faith and Germanic Rite, the religious syncretism of the North. And in the broader process of evangelization in that case of the European populations, you have these things. I mean, accepting Christ for many people was not really was not considered in opposite directly as a refusal to the old gods. On the contrary, because from a it's the monotheists that invented the division monotheism, polytheism. A polytheist, there was the standard at that time, for very few exceptions, essentially reasoned as if, it was normal that there were several gods that you could worship at once. So even Christianity was integrated in this mindset, like saying, okay, let's use it just like we do all the rest. So, and really, the more I read, especially about early medieval times, the more I realize how many pagan beliefs actually remained, even when these societies were namely fully Christianized, alongside the Christian beliefs. There's nothing really strange and wrong. It's also, very natural if you think about it. So what else? What did the Cenobites do at this point? First of all, they were, as we've seen, they were put on under a same rule. They had a collective discipline. They had a common time schedule. Very importantly, they carried out artisanal works. Especially they weaved. They were into weaving because it was something relatively easy to do and also relatively remunerative. In fact, these communities were kind of specializing also in the production of textile products that were eventually sold into cities, into other places, so from which they would bring other tools that could be useful for survival. So you see, at this point, not a deprivation, not a general idea. There was still a model poverty that permeated the whole experience, but still, we'll see. That this society could evolve and had to evolve. There was really nothing wrong with that, and this naturally entailed there was always someone in the community that was in contact with the seculum in a way or in another, because either it was the same monks that went selling this stuff somewhere, or there were other merchants who passed by. There was still interaction with the outer world, let's say, the secular world. But the activities were the most diverse. You find pastoralism among monastic communities was definitely developed. Also agricultural works, as we've seen, and other community services like what we would call welfare at this point, or assistance, sanitary assistance, something like that. There was naturally a great part of diurnal and nocturnal recitation of the biblical psalms, and the reading and meditation of the Holy Scriptures, of course. So, what did regulate this? Well, of course, certain texts that were disciplining the monks were written down, and initially in Egypt at this point they were written in Coptic language. And however, the other, kind of, it's like the English of the time, it was Greek, so they were immediately translated into this language that could be understood in most of Mediterranean, especially in the eastern one, and that were to be the base of the so-called monastic rule, in Latin the regula. And such rules were actually quite meticulous. The objective was to essentially foresee all the various faults, errors that monks could fall into, so that this could be could be essentially prevented to happen. And there was also a hierarchy, as we've seen, that with the abbot, that was this, the most authoritative figure, but he also had priors at this point that were helping him directly, directing the community. And at this point, the kind of the climate of austere and hierarchical discipline was pretty out there. I mean, the idea that the abbot had to correct the unstraight, the unorthodox, let's say, behavior of the monks was out there. It was conceived like that. Obviously, the concept of sacred, as we've seen, was very important. So it wasn't just something just aimed at maintaining discipline. There was an additional reason for asking this and to enforce it in some ways. Now, also we know relatively few how these communities really lived. But we can imagine also kind of relatively trivial things happening, and also that these environments were not necessarily, extremely peaceful. For instance, it could, wrong things could surely happen. At the same time, it was kind of a very open world, probably. I mean, there was definitely a requirement, because you couldn't really join the community at this point or anything just for the sake of it. But this really, if you were not showing certain qualities and certain proofs, and there was probably certain preparation since the very beginning it was required, probably, and I'm not really aware of this, but especially in these more desolated areas, probably there was a sort of proof of sort of test of the newcomers, so those who wanted to participate and join the community, maybe in the wilderness or with some other. And so this hermetic experimentations and its foundations, either whether there were male monasteries or female monasteries, were spreading in their Cenobitic model also to Palestine and Syria. So also in here, actually in desertic areas that were often secluded from the rest of the world, but still, however, close to human settlements, other human settlements. This is very important because this reconfirms basically the need for this world to remain kind of in contact in one way or another with civilization. From here, the Cenobitic model arrived also into Asia Minor, and here basically culminated, the Cenobitic organization culminated after slightly after the mid-4th century with the teaching of Basil of Caesarea in Cappadocia. He was a famous rhetor at the time. He was son of another rhetor, as it was normal, like the ancient world. So this, especially at this time, this continuous, this ever growing, attachment of social crystallization, for which if your father was a rhetor, you most likely would become a rhetor. So what is interesting about this is it could be also a cause of the same monasticism in part, where people were rebellious to the social institution and they felt the different vocation and wanted to go out there. But probably the most important thing is that these were cultured people. There were people with a very good education, and in fact, Saint Basil also belonged to this very rich and influent, actually, Christian family. Because at this point, as we were saying, in the 4th century, Christians now were finally fully integrated into society, and they were, making career and so on. And that became a monk, and eventually was elected bishop in his own city of Caesarea. So, as we were saying before, monastic experiences that, however, were intertwining in some ways also with the secular ones. So, as in part of the city clergy and this ecclesiastical administration that at the time was becoming also increasingly engaged in political tasks, because basically with Constantine you have the church that is formally authorized also to partly take care of certain of the communities, in part just like previously certain laymen had done. So this dualism was very, very important, although as you know, monastic history is quite varied in many ways. So in part these experiences were eventually there was always an inner tension between the church, the secular church, and monasticism, also because, as we've said, certain monks were maybe not excessively orthodox. This was the main part. I mean, cities at this time could be very unorthodox as well, but the idea is, however, that the city is a kind of a more it's the secular clergy is kind of put under more direct pressure by politics, by economy. At this point the empire is still based on cities practically, and the cities are still functional. The rural world sometimes even escaped the direct control of the secular authorities. Also, the secular authorities at this point were, in fact, both as lay or ecclesiastical, were essentially trying to frame, to create a districtuation of the empire on the base of both the state and of the church. So the monasteries were instead implicitly refusing this model. We're saying we're out of it. We're not part of that net of relationships. We're not part of this world proper. We are building something on our own that is not meant to interfere or to enter into the secular world, into which we are not interested, because we have chosen a life of seclusion, and we don't want to participate to that. But if not, showing you how we live, so in the hope that you will eventually join us. But so what was happening in the monasteries could be really very... And in fact, if you look at the history of monasticism in general, there is that video I made on the iconoclasm that addresses in part this thing, is that monasteries, especially in early medieval times, in many areas of Christianity, would become kind of a parallel power, a parallel point of reference to the for the local communities, especially the rural ones. So even iconoclasm, among all the other patterns you can interpret it, can be seen also from this perspective. I mean, the actual statal and ecclesiastical organization that wants to put an end to the power of monasteries were growing, however, enormously rich, especially in the Byzantine world, and that had indulged sometimes through the icons and through something more into the kind of the exaltation of certain local cults in certain ways. Normally I'm generally against iconoclasm, at least I think but it's a very foggy, I'm against. I tend to see it mostly from a Western perspective. I'm very supportive of especially of the Roman Church in that early medieval times, and objectively the Byzantines were doing strange things for Christian doctrinal standards. So that's why I generally look at iconoclasm like, but actually we know very few about that period. Also because we don't have many sources. We don't really know what iconoclasm is. There are so many hypotheses, actually good ones, but we can't really focus everything well. But among the other things, it seems that certain monasteries had been basically developed a sort of syncretism between Christianity and certain particular local cults that were now also being overlapped by certain saints, because the idea is that now the monastery was dominating over certain communities as if it was a kind of a state on its own, and plus enforcing this kind of unorthodox thinking relatively to the local cults and their veneration, because most of those communities had in fact remained, they were nominally Christian, but they had remained pagan, and therefore looked at with great sympathy when the monastery was kind of trying to integrate this great work of syncresis the local cults into a Christian system. This is also think about all the saints, all the shrines that were converted from paganism to Christianity. In fact, the saints, some of them were coming from certain local pagan deities that were transformed like that. So in part, there was even this kind of unorthodox things that most monasteries would. I mean, not most. I mean, a substantial part of the monasteries at some time has operated in that, especially in the moment of the origins, because this is the real problem. Is that also the church was not so massively structured, didn't have such an extent control over the situation, and sometimes even the state lacked this control effectively, and pretending to change the mindset of someone in the 6th and 7th century through the meaning of the state is pretty difficult. You don't have basically any mean. So sometimes you have even to cope with this, like for instance Constantinople did, by sometimes backing certain heterodoxy to maybe maintain even the control over certain regions that otherwise would have seceded from the empire or rebelled. As you wanna seceded, not because that was not really the case, but however de facto detach themselves from the empire proper. So at this point I would pass through, this is a kind of general reflection, I would pass to Pachomius. Looking at his life and a little bit, so it's not really just in a nutshell, basically. First of all, what it really strikes you, as we were saying before, is the background he had. He was born seemingly from a pagan family. So basically the very first Cenobitic founder was born pagan, just like other great fathers of the church. Think about St. Augustine, for instance. So he was a soldier. Interestingly enough, he served in Isna, where he eventually converted to Christianity. This is also one of the several stories that he was born around in inferior Thebes in Egypt, around the end of the 3rd century, perhaps 292 AD in Po. No, sorry, he died in Po. Eventually, he was born. I don't know where actually he was born. And also here, the spread of Christianity in the army was normal. Many people think, oh well, the Roman army declined because there were Christians in there. No, that's essentially a myth. There is no historical proof of this. There were obviously certain Christians, there were Christian soldiers at a certain point saying, I don't want to kill, but they were virtually influent. We don't have any proof that this was a structural problem, and the combativity of Roman legions, of the Roman army, there is no way to historically assess it was altered by the conversion to even of the same empire to Christianity. It's completely false. So if you look at the warlike cult, the ethos, even of Byzantine soldiers in the 7th century, you realize they were still completely. I mean, they were Christian, but they were pagan in mindset. I mean, they searched for glory, blood, and loot, etc., as any other soldier had been up to that point. So certain things really never change and do not influence radically the history of the world. Also because it doesn't seem that the world, the Christian world, was less warlike than before. On the contrary, I mean, it was pretty much the same. So I don't want to say that Christianity increased the combativity either, because it's just naive. So he also, interestingly enough, Pachomius began his spiritual journey under the influence of another anachorete called Palamo, who he followed for some years. And so he got used to this rigorous ascetic doctrine, living in absolute poverty and practicing how do you say it in English? He abstained from eating. Essentially, he he fasted. Yeah, this is the term. Spending nights in prayer and so on. So Pachomius basically was acquainted with the limits of anachoretism, trying to, at this point also from his point of view, to basically pass to solve it, to regulate it, to orientate these experiences towards a more disciplined form, because eventually there had been probably some problems also in that sense, because there were several of these people now that were out there, but there was no order. So the Cenobitic rule, as we've seen, came from very strict pragmatic reasons. So Pachomius went to Tabenese, I think, on the banks of the Nile, and he gathered several disciples that reached about 100 in number. And here, for them, he organized this common life, prescribing a rule and becoming this essentially expert master of spiritual life. So this attracted in over time, this increased the flow of disciples towards his community, and this brought eventually Pachomius to found other monasteries in other areas like Pov, Seneset, then Temusson and Tebio, then in Akhmim, known as at the time as Panopolis, and also even south of this in Phanom. Also, Pachomius died because of an epidemic that at those times were striking the empire. So kind of a difficult life, as you can imagine. And he, looking at his thought generally from what we can know, excuse me, I drink a little bit before. Really, Pachomius became famous, as we've seen, for the merit of having, for the first time, as far as we can trace back at least historically, to have conceived the ascetic life as a sort of life in common. In the observation of a rule, it was valid for all those who for all of those who participated and were under the direction of a superior within the the milieu of a same of a cohabitation, basically. So as we've seen before, also the rule was originally written in Coptic. Actually, we know the rule, Pachomius rule, through a Ethiopian translation, and from the Latin version of a Greek translation that now it's instead lost, of the Coptic original language. And only basically recently we have found different other fragments. And initially the monks, by this rule, the monks had to live essentially a pretty stern lifestyle. They had to fast on Wednesday, on Friday, and having 2 meals in the other days. And this severity was justified on the base that on the idea that nobody could miss, in this sense, for weakness to the work or the other obligations of common life. I mean, the idea that everybody had to do their best for the community. This was interesting enough, because without the community, basically, even the individual can't achieve certain perfection. This is very interesting also, because now the attention was always towards the inner side, but also was transposed to the whole group of people. So these people gathered for 5 times a day for prayer in common, and on Sunday, on Saturday and on Sunday for the Mass. That obviously were important in the perspective. So you see, there is a time schedule. This is important. Also, cyclicity in this experience, and these monks had to work according to their own capacities and needs of the community, also following the eventual exceptional instructions of the superior in the hierarchy. Also, looking at these settlements, early Cenobitic settlements, you see that the monks lived in 2 monasteries, were surrounded by fences, and also split in essentially in houses, where essentially 30 monks could live all together. In common, they had the church, the library, the refectory, the dining hall, substantially, and the place of the reunion, the kitchen, and the also the warehouse. I mean, the stock, the pantry. I don't know how to say that. So this is important because it was stressing that basically there was also a within the same community there were certain spaces that were in common, others that were kind of more private. As we've seen, the community was kind of universally oriented, but there was still a space for the individual where this person could also be tested practically. Every house was managed by a kind of a sort of proposed person, and at the head of a monastery, another superior. As we've seen, Pachomius founded several monasteries, so now the rule had to contemplate also, that this rule had to be observed by other people had to be made respected by other people, rather other abbots, rather than Pachomius himself. At the same time, it was not an extremely harsh rule, as we've seen, and on the contrary, probably the fortune of Pachomius' fortune was owed to kind of the balance and moderation of his rule, among others that maybe were even more radical and we kind of lost track of because they didn't have a spread like the Pachomian monasteries. And you have to think that even in Pachomius' life, when the Pachomian monks were something like tens of thousands. So just understand even what it means to organize a number of people like those. It's not a few, especially in that world where there are few resources, and also you're basically a no one because you don't have initially the support of the state or someone who could help you. So these were quite spontaneous initiatives that were gathering so many people that evidently were anxious of sharing this experience. Consider tens of thousands of people. It doesn't matter whether it's Egypt. It was a fairly well populated province of the empire, but it's still quite consistently quite consistent endemic concentration, a portion of society into the late antiquity. So as we've seen, this eventually the Pachomius rule extended beyond the Egyptian borders. It went up to all over the Eastern world, and eventually the Cenobitic experience arrived in the West thanks to the work of Caesarius of Arles and also of Cassiodorus, that basically was reforming the Cenobitic rule of Pachomius, and in a certain sense favored and posed the basis for also the same, I mean at least indirectly, for Benedictine monasticism. This is important because the idea of rewriting a rule is important. It's basically you're directing that world, you're framing it, you're shaping it, you're essentially giving it an order that is supposed to be in fact the best one in Christian terms, and it's not something easy to do. And if you look at these rules also, the Benedict, well, obviously they're all kind of different, but what strikes is also the very pragmatical nature of this. I mean, the idea was that the spiritual experience didn't quite need an explanation for itself. Obviously, yeah, we've seen that these monks had to pray every once in a while in the day. They were kind of tied to this practice, but at the same time, most of the dispositions are very practical, very material. Everything was kind of controlled because this stemmed from practice, evidently, and these rules were quite pragmatically oriented. They weren't just abstractions or ideals and so on. They were pretty even material in many ways. And we can say that from Pachomius probably wrote something down in his life, but in Coptic, but we basically don't have anything directly from him. So there is just a catechesis that is now preserved at in a manuscript at the British Museum, and that is, usually, I mean, traditionally attributed to him, but for us, we don't have, even from the same rule in Coptic, nothing but a few fragments, so not even the full thing. But it's important because this text circulated, and even if you look at Benedictine monasticism, you realize that for some people today even argue that basically Saint Benedict is not a real historical figure, because objectively, if you look at it, there were these names in the rules. This person has created, but there is no objective, you don't have a really, aside from tradition, this evidence, historical evidence you need. And what you have instead as an evidence is lots of rules that were circulating at the time, and that were eventually, even philologically speaking, intertwined the one with the other. So it means that these people basically were basing their order on even sometimes on the authority of figures like Pachomius, that that now we're kind of re-elaborating them or crossing them with other modifications that had been carried out. So even the Benedictine rule, that is, whoever wrote it down, is a very intelligent text. If you read it, you understand so many things about that word. It's fine. But also in here, it belonged to a tradition of monastic regulation that was very, very developed I mean, not excessively developed, because these were still, especially in the West, relatively still small communities, and they didn't have an excessive, a huge power like it would be. The same Benedictine rule essentially was stemming from an extremely poor environment after the devastations of the Gothic War with the plague. So there were still small things, but in the essentials, it's important that they were looking at the best ways to solve problems, and that's where they strike you, because you find a logic behind that. Even in the same concept, the Benedictine concept of working and praying, or better, praying and working in order, it's so, for that time, it's so revealing also about that society, and it's definitely a very interesting read. Okay, some other time we will do also Basil of Caesarea. Now I don't have time, unfortunately, but let's split videos now, since they are rather long by themselves. So for now, I thank you. I hope that you enjoyed this video. If you did, please share it. Otherwise, leave a like or subscribe to my channel if you're interested in my upcoming contents. And for now, I thank you heartily for listening to me. I wish you a nice time, and see you next time. Bye.